Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of America in Black and White. Happy Juneteenth to everyone that's celebrating. And we have a special for you tonight. Well, we will have Mr. Jacques Whitfield with us, and we will be discussing DEI. Let me tell you a little bit about Mr. Whitfield. He is a principal of Sterling Consulting Limited, a boutique consulting agency that provides coaching and consultation, training and development, and strategic planning for public and private sector organizations. Whitfield is a seasoned human resources and DEIB executive with over 25 years of experience in public and private sector human resources management, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Whitfield recently retired from his position as senior practice leader for DEIB with CPS HR Consulting. During Whitfield's tenure as the DEIB senior practice leader, the organization expanded its scope of practice from coast to coast with a focus in California, Colorado, Texas, Florida, and New York, serving local governments, public education, and state agencies. Prior to joining CPS HR Consulting, Whitfield served as the Chief Human Resources Officer for the Yuba Community College District. Whitfield was responsible for the management and oversight of the human resources operations for the district, which serves two colleges, Yuba College and Woodland Community College, and multiple education centers. Whitfield served as the Chief EEO and Title IX Compliance Officer for the district. Whitfield attended college at Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, where he graduated in 1985 with honors, earning a BA degree in history with a minor in French. While at Wake Forest, Whitfield attended the University of Dijon in Dijon, France, studying at the International Center for French Studies. Upon graduating from college, Whitfield entered the University of North Carolina School of Law in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Whitfield graduated in 1988 with distinction as a member of the Order of the Barrister. Whitfield is the father of four amazing children: Ashley Elizabeth, Chase Sterling, James Casper, and Joshua Jordan. Whitfield has served on numerous civic organizations and boards of directors, including Empowering Possibilities Unlimited, board chairman, Sacramento Children's Home, the North Sacramento Redevelopment Advisory Committee, Nehemiah Ventures Incorporated, Concord Mortgage Bank, American Leadership Forum, Mount Valley Chapter, Equality California, the Sacramento Gay and Lesbian Center, Center for AIDS Research and Educational Services, Friends of the Area Congregations Together. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to bring Mr. Jacques Whitfield to the show, please. Hello, sir.
Hello, how are you?
I am excellent. How are you?
I'm great, and that was a beautiful introduction. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, you're very much welcome. Is there anything else that you'd like to add to your bio?
Nothing to my bio, but I'm currently, I'm headquartered in Sacramento, California, as you pointed out. I'm currently visiting my family in the Washington, D.C. area. So I am enjoying the beautiful DMV and all of your extremely warm weather. So it's nice to be on the East Coast. It's nice to be back with family. And more importantly, it's nice to be with you and your audience today to talk about a topic that's very near and dear to me, which is the topic of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So thank you so much for having me.
Well, I definitely appreciate that. And, let's just dive right on into this because
Let's get to it.
Because this is definitely, something I think we should discuss on today, especially. Can you tell us in the beginning, tell us about DEI? What is DEI?
So great question. First of all, I want to wish happy Juneteenth to all of your participants and listeners. And I think it's a very relevant topic and a very relevant day that we're discussing So the timing is universally absolutely perfect. So I think it's important because words matter that we start at the beginning and we recognize what is DEI. And I like to, I'm a student of crucial conversations. I believe in the power of contrast. So let me tell you what DEI is not. So DEI is not having discussions about shame and blame. DEI is not political correctness. It's not being woke. It is not a reboot of affirmative action. It's not, like I said, it's not just mere political correctness where you're checking the box. DEI at its essence and core is really all about engagement. How do we create connection, belonging, and safety for every single human being within our organizations, whether those organizations are public sector or private sector? And as you shared at the outset in the introduction, I work primarily in the public sector space. So I work a lot with local governments. I work a lot with public education entities. I work a lot with state agencies. So this is an engagement strategy that touches every single human in the organization that is designed to create connection, belonging, and safety for others. Physical safety, and more importantly, psychological safety. When I come into an organization, do I have the ability to grow, to thrive, to excel, to be my authentic self and come as my authentic self, as opposed to code switching or having to mask a portion of who I am. I think that's so important, especially in the 21st century and in the world that we're living today. I'm a proud baby boomer. I'm 60 years young, and I can certainly remember when I first started in my employment career. I started in the 1980s. So in the 20th century was not a space for being our authentic selves, right? It was all about how do I fit into the corporate structure, whether if that corporate structure was in business or whether it was in government, but it was about me molding myself. It was certainly not a concept of me bringing my entire self within an organization, right? And so I think the way my agency facilitates conversations around DEI, it really is an engagement strategy. It's an enterprise strategy. And when I say enterprise, I'm meaning touching every single aspect of the organization. Charles, and I know we've had conversations about this before, but I also think it's important to unpack the D, the E, and the I, right? Because people say titles and names without really understanding what does it mean. So when I talk about diversity, I mean the entire spectrum of humanity. There are 8 billion people on the planet as of today. And so the universe of diversity is all 8 billion people. Now, in the 20th century, that was not the case. Diversity was really designated for those individuals who were not white or who were not of European descent. Diversity in the 20th century was a very othering conversation. And so what we've seen from the passage of the civil rights legislation, beginning with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and that continued federal legislation, was really an expansion of who gets included in the diversity universe. And so today, when I talk about diversity, I talk about the sum total of all humanity. And that's important, Charles, because if this is an engagement strategy, how can we effectively engage if we don't see ourselves represented in the platform, right? Represented in the universe. So diversity is everyone. Now, when I talk about equity is really meaning the removal of barriers to create maximum outcomes for every human being within an organization. Now, there's a nuanced distinction between equity and equality. For many of us in the United States, if we're educated in the United States, if we're accultured in the United States, we certainly understand the concept of equality, whether we've experienced it or not, right? Because let's acknowledge that, while there have been there's been much progress, there's still a lot of work to do. So there's a nuanced distinction between equity and equality. And I like that, since we're in Juneteenth and people are cooking out, I like to use this analogy. So if I'm having a cookout at my house, and we'll actually be cooking out on Friday for any of y'all that are in the DMV, so I'm gonna be on the grill. But if I'm having a cookout, I'm inviting you all over to my house, and I'm serving everyone grilled porterhouse steaks.
Okay.
Now that's awesome if you're a carnivore. That's awesome if you're a red meat eater. But what if you don't eat red meat? What if you're vegetarian, pescatarian? What if you're fasting? What if everyone is getting the same thing, which is the grilled porterhouse steak, but everyone doesn't have the same level of enjoyment. That is the concept of equity. Everybody is treated the same within the same classification. I'm sorry, that's the definition of equality. Everybody gets the same. Now, equity is a bit more nuanced. So in the equity analogy, same situation. Jacques having a cookout on Friday. If you're in the DMV, stop by. But this time, through the lens of equity, I'm going to reach out to folks beforehand and say, do you have any dietary restrictions? Do you have any food allergies? Do you have any food preferences? And so for the folks who are, vegetarian, I may make them a vegetarian dish, a nice summer salad. For the folks who are pescatarian, you get some nice wild caught Alaskan salmon. For the folks who are chicken, who like chicken, you get nice, roasted chicken. And of course, for the carnivores, you get that grilled porterhouse steak, cooked however you want it. So that's the difference. And people ask, equity or equality, which one is most important? That's a trick question, because they're both important. In the 21st century, we were very focused on the concept of equality. Let's give everybody within the same classification the same thing. And we developed conversations around fairness by whether or not we got the same thing. Mm-hmm. In the equity conversation, it's really about, how do I create maximum success, maximum fulfillment for every single individual, recognizing that no two individuals are the same. There are no two humans on the planet that have the same lived experience. So now I get to flex to give people what they need in order to be successful. So that's the concept of equity. And inclusion is, simply put, when I come into an organization, can I be my authentic self and go as fast as I want, as far as I want, as high as I want in the organization? Or are there some barriers, known or unknown, that are limiting my growth, that are limiting my development, that are limiting my full enjoyment of, fully participating within the organization? Inclusion is action. And inclusion is something that we must be very, very intentional about. So I like giving those definitions, because when you talk about diversity being the sum total of all humanity, equity being the removal of barriers to create outcomes, and inclusion being, creating pathways for every organization to have maximum fulfillment. When you present it like that, who in the world would be concepts?
Wow.
So that's the overview of DEI. And I think that would really be helpful, so that we can have a meaningful conversation around, what this engagement strategy is versus what it is not, and how are folks reacting, and how are folks responding to this situation.
I have a question here in the chat, and the question is, I just learned about this. Is this a new movement or ideology or term?
So if this being DEI is new, so let me answer the question a bunch of different ways. So is DEI new? This has been an evolutionary organizational trend since the 60s. And as I said at the outset, this began with the passage of the federal civil rights legislation, beginning with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, every decade since the 1960s, there has been continued federal and the corresponding state legislation that's expanded the pool. So in the 1960s, the federal legislation was very targeted. It was to ameliorate the impact of de facto and de jure segregation that existed in the United States, not just in the South, but all across the country. And so what we saw in successive years, in the 70s, we expanded the conversations of equality to include gendered females. And many of us recall and remember, who were around that time, the women's liberation movement, the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, which is still not passed, but has been approved by many jurisdictions, California, where I live, being one of them. But it still has not become federal law because enough states have not passed that. But there's still been conversations about how do we expand the rights of gendered females, the rights of gendered females. Again, with the change in the the U.S. Census categorizations, for the first time, they included Hispanics or what we call now the Latino, Latina, Latinx community. We also had the beginnings of the LGBTQ liberation movement, which started in the Stonewall riots back in the 70s and continuing until now. In the 90s, we saw the passage of the first Americans with Disabilities Act, which expanded the rights of folks living with all types of disabilities. And every single decade, we continue to broaden and expand the rights of more and more Americans to include folks to include pregnancy, to include indigenous status, to include veteran status, such that today the definition of diversity includes all human beings. I also missed the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, which expanded the rights of individuals who were age 40 and over. So this has been a recurring and expanding and evolving movement and conversation. And let's also acknowledge, especially for the participant who asked the question, the names have changed. So in the 60s and 70s, very, very focused on Black empowerment, Black liberation. And so, we talked about that in the 70s. We talked about called fairness. It's been called diversity. And there have been conversations around diversity for several decades. And then most recently, it was diversity and inclusion. In 2020, in the wake of the George Floyd murder and the social justice movement that ensued from the George Floyd, we now included the equity. So DEI is a new term, and now we talk about DEI. We talk about DEIB and belonging. In other jurisdictions, they talk about DEIA, diversity, equity, inclusion. So language changes, but the theme has been consistently ever evolving and ever expanding.
There's another question here. Do you think DEI is a formal way to compromise with Black folks, considering they want us to have our own Black Wall Street?
Good question. So, for me, I think ultimately what I work towards is a liberation philosophy that uplifts and empowers every single human being. We've talked about, the right of self-determination, the right of individuals to operate in maximum self-agency. And I believe that should be available for all of the peoples of planet Earth. I think that we as humans should work towards that goal, no matter how ambitious that goal is. I appreciate the reference to Black Wall Street, in reference to, not just what existed in Tulsa, Oklahoma, but in so many Black and Brown communities all over the United States. I think economic empowerment is important for every community, not just the Black community. And yes, I do believe that this is an effective strategy that can support all people, including Black people, uplift and empower themselves and become fully connected and integrated in this global village that we find ourselves in.
So tell us this: how has the landscape of DEI in the workplace evolved over the past decade?
Great question. So over the past decade, what we've seen, if I look at from 2014 to 2024, and that's great. I love that question, Charles, because think about it. In 2014, America was led by the first African-American president of the United States, Barack Obama. And think about all of the advances that we believed we were experiencing at that time. And if we go to 2024, we're now find ourselves in a rematch, if you will, of the 2020 elections between former President Donald Trump and current President Joseph Biden. And let's remember that right after the presidency of Barack Obama, America responded by electing Donald Trump, who set about to unwind and roll back many of those advances from the Obama years. So within this 10 years, folks, we've seen a lot. We've seen a lot. And one would ask, well, are we making progress? Are we not making progress? Are we reverting? Are we going back in time? And, I look at the entire arc of American history. And when you look at, and I think it's so important that we're having this conversation on Juneteenth, right? Because what happened after the Civil War and after the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, we saw incredible economic, political, social advances for the formerly enslaved Africans or African Americans. We saw Black people elected to office, Black people, beginning to move about the country freely. We saw many advances in education. Many of the historically Black colleges and universities were started during this period of time. And then we note after Reconstruction was something that history refers to as the Grand Compromise. And what that was purely and simply was a compromise between the former Confederate states and the Union, if you will. So the Union Army withdrew from the South, and the South was allowed home rule, which was good for Southern whites and not so good for Southern Blacks. And what we saw and how the Supreme Court responded really initiated 100 years of Jim Crow. And I think the case was Plessy versus Ferguson, which solidified or codified, if you will, the concept of separate but equal. That is, that Black people were equal, but we are separate. And you and I know, Charles, what that meant for my grandparents, what that meant for my parents, what that meant for me, because I was born in 63, a year or so before the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. What that meant is that we were relegated to become permanent second-class citizens. So this was a permanent caste system in the United States based on race. So we've seen these ebbs and flows throughout American history, right? And so what we're seeing now is very, very similar to what we as a people, what we as a country has experienced over the last 100 years or so. So, yes, we're still making advances, and we have seen the pendulum swing back and forth because there's been this theme, if you will, of anti-blackness. There's no other way to say it. You know, when you look at the Constitution of the United States, and when you see still in the Constitution of the United States, you can point out the 3/5 clause. That's something that the founders put in. Why we as so let me put it this way. So I'm my family's historian, right? I've been working on my family history project for 42 years. I started this project as a junior in high school. So I have traced back my family 8 generations. I'm the 8th generation of my family line in the United States. My great grandmother's great grandfather is Mr. George Keith. My great grandmother's great grandfather, the way I found him through my research, was looking through property records of old plantations in southeastern North Carolina. Now, sometimes I like to play the game, what if? What if my great grandmother's great grandfather could pass off a tenth, just 1/10 of the wealth that he generated in the American colonies before, in the British colonies before it was even the United States, and was able to pass that down for 8 successive generations? I would be wealthier than Elon Musk. In fact, many people of African descent, if our ancestors, if our forefathers and foremothers had agency, had citizenship, could own and possess property, could pass on wealth, the wealth picture in the United States demographically would look radically different than it looks today, right? And so, recognizing that, we've got to appreciate where we started. And where we started was from, clearly, by all accounts, a disadvantaged position where the first 3 generations of my 8 generation family line did not even have personhood. We were considered chattel, not real property. But also remember, women were chattel. Gendered females could not. It was probably 1970 when women in the United States could even open checking accounts and saving accounts and financial instruments without the co-signature of a gendered male. Often it would be a father or a husband. So think about it. It's not just people of African descent, but it's gendered immigrants, it's indigenous folks. Lots of people by government policy were denied full equality. And so I think it's important, as a word nerd, I think it's important to say all the words, because that provides clarity and context to where we are and how much further we get to go and grow.
Wow. So, what about this? What are some effective strategies organizations can implement to foster a sense of belonging among diverse employees?
So, another great question. And I'd like to address that question by expanding the end. So, yes, diverse employees and all humans. So, my first job, we didn't share in the bio. So, my first job was I was a 7th grade math teacher. I was a long-term substitute. And it's funny because math was not my best subject. I was, again, when you read my bio, I was into the humanities, histories, languages. And so math was difficult for me. So as a math teacher, I put myself in the position of the student where math was difficult and said, how do I make this interesting and safe and engaging, especially for the students who don't like math? And how can I present it in such a way that everybody will lean in and say, oh, wow, this is not as hard as I thought it was. I think I can do this. And I think conversations around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging need to be approached in the same fashion, right? Full disclosure, I'm a student of critical race theory. And I also know that when you lead in some organizations and in some settings, when you lead with that, you get the same reaction that students who don't like math in a math class have that reaction, which is one of resistance. And
Mhm.
so, is there a way that we can present these concepts in a way that is effective and non threatening? I'm not talking about watering down the message. I'm talking about, can we be effective teachers and effective cultural guides to bring everyone to the point where they see the necessity of creating connection, belonging, safety for every single individual within an organization. And there is a way. I've been working on this strategy for the last 4 or 5 years, and that is through presenting these conversations through emotional intelligence, through cultural intelligence, through neuroscience. Let me tell you why I think that's more effective. There's this concept, and I'll nerd out just a bit, so there'll probably be some questions, and I'll go slow. So there's this concept in neuroscience called generative interactivity. I'll say that again, generative interactivity. And what this concept says, the more different types of individuals I bring into a creative space, and if I give all of the individuals in that space the same tools, the same access, the same mobility, the same opportunity, and they are all diverse and divergent from one another, my potential for creating creative outcomes, creative solutions exponentially increases based on the different types of people in the room, as opposed to having all the same type of individual in the room. If I have a homogenous room, same age, same gender, same educational background, same social background, same close to the same lived experience, my diverse group is going to be far more creative with their output than that homogenous group. So neuroscience has taught us that, right?
Mhm.
And so if we approach DEI through neuroscience and saying, yeah, we're not going to talk about if it's the right thing to do. What we're going to say is it's the most effective thing to do to create all of these maximum outcomes. Then my outcome is going to be far greater. If I lead with it's the right thing to do, and Charles, I know you and I've had this conversation. I get 10 people in the room and we're going to say, okay, folks, we're going to do the right thing. I promise you, there are going to be 10 different ideas about what the right thing to do is. Now, full disclosure, I do believe in social justice.
Mhm.
Also, full disclosure, when I do the work of DEI engagement, I am not leading with social justice. I am leading with neuroscience. I am leading with cultural intelligence. I am leading with emotional intelligence. And what I found in the government space and the education space, that when you lead with neuroscience, when you lead with emotional and cultural intelligence, and cultural intelligence is having the capacity to relate to and to work with different types of people across different cultures. And culture, in this sense, is through the anthropological lens, culture meaning people. Okay. So when I'm leading with human intelligence, emotional intelligence, I'm going to get far greater outcome because it's not advocacy conversation, it is engagement conversation. I think there are times when you get to lead with advocacy. There are times that you get to lead with engagement, with meeting people where they are. And I think we are so fragmented around this topic in the United States as we sit here today, that we need to have a more effective way to bypass all the pitfalls and the minefields and the booby traps that certain folks have created by weaponizing these terms. It's crazy to me, Charles, that people would weaponize equity and think that equity is a bad thing. And yet I read, just like you do, that you have certain elements in the US Congress, for example, who want to take formal action against equity. And I'm like, what kind of human are you know, from a human perspective, even if you look at all the good things that equity does.
Yeah.
For, you know, if I'm non-ambulatory and I'm in a wheelchair or a device, right? And that device is was problematic, you know, getting on and off sidewalks. But then when you make the cut curves, that that wheels can go, you know, easily navigate sidewalks. You're not only supporting folks who are non-ambulatory, you're supporting folks on skateboards and you know, baby carriages, and you know, also it lifts all people. And that approach, I believe, is the more effective approach, especially in the government space.
Okay. So, in your experience, what role does leadership play in driving meaningful DEI initiatives, and how can leaders ensure these initiatives are impactful?
I love that question. And we can say that again for the people in the back. Let me tell you, it's real simple to me, Charles. The engagements that I take on, I refuse to because I'm not about checking the box, right? I really want to move the needle. And I know it takes work to move the needle. But you know what it takes more than work to move the needle? It takes a dedicated commitment from leadership. If leadership is not center and front in this effort, I'm promising you it's not going to be effective. Now, I've worked with organizations that, you know, when I would meet with the leadership team, and they would say, oh, well, you know, we've got a committee and you'll be working with the committee. And my next question is, okay, so when do you get to lead the committee? Because yes, it's a team effort, but the team needs to see leaders front and center. And I'm pleased to report that, you know, I work with courageous leaders of all different ethnicities all across the country who are leading this effort. And I work in Florida, and I work in Texas, and I work in Colorado, in addition to California and New York. And so I don't know what you hear on the media, but there are really engaged folks in Florida and in Texas and in Colorado who are white and white male and, you know, all the things, who are leading these efforts. And it's truly awesome to be a part of. But these folks recognize the importance that if leadership is the problem, leadership gets to be the solution. So to me, it's absolutely critical that leaders lead. And you can't have it any other way, because, again, if they're not present, folks know it. I remember, you know, my days when I was working as a K-12 administrator, and you could tell when the superintendent, when she was leading an initiative, or when he was leading an initiative, or when they were leading an initiative, versus when it was a committee or it was the superintendent was not involved. Because everybody knows in an organization, you know, does leadership really care about this, or is this just some window dressing stuff that we got to do? And that to me is the qualifier about whether I choose to work with an organization or not. I want to know where leadership is, even if, and this is my favorite type of organization to work with, leadership is committed, but they don't know how to get there. And they're very transparent about, look, we've heard these things in the news. I don't know which way is up, but I do know I want to do the most effective thing for all of the people in my organization. And that vulnerability, that transparency is powerful, and it's magnetic, because you can feel it in the organization that my leadership cares about this initiative. So I think it's absolutely critical. I don't think you can have success without leadership involvement. Absolutely.
I have another question here from the chat.
Okay.
So it says, so how do you get people of privilege to abandon their privilege to effectively implement DEI?
Love that question. So again, I get to be a word nerd here. And privilege is a thing. Okay, let's first and foremost acknowledge that for the audience. And let's go back to that math analogy. If I lead with white privilege, white privilege, white privilege, in my experience, now let me be clear, there are lots of different effective strategies. The strategies that I'm sharing with you, Charles, and with your audience are strategies that I have found successful. There are other successful strategies that are out there, but I'm not a subject matter subject matter expert on those. So I'm powerfully choosing not to share those because that hasn't been my experience. So when and most of the organizations that I work with are in predominantly white organizations, right? I don't use the term privilege. Is it a thing? Yes. I prefer to use the term capital. There are two types of capital: performance capital and relationship capital. Performance capital says my value comes from how I perform, by what I do on the job, by being effective, by meeting or exceeding all of the goals and objectives, right? The other type of capital that humans have within organizations is relationship capital. My capital comes from my proximity to another human being. Now, when we think about mentorship programs, career ladder programs, emerging leader programs, those programs are specifically designed to enhance the relationship capital of the participants. Now, Charles, it's really interesting. And I read Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility. I love her work and I love her book, and I've had a chance to hear her speak. So I'm a fan. And I know if I bring that book in a lot of predominantly white organizations, especially law enforcement, they're going to run me up out of there. When I lead with conversations around capital, it's so funny because everybody starts nodding their head. Everybody says, yeah, capital's a good thing. We want to have, relationship capital. We want to have it. And then the punchline, when I tell them, well, y'all know for the last 30 minutes, we've been talking about capital. Another word for capital. And they're like, what? Well, you've already got them then. And I say, it's called privilege. They're already there. They've already admitted it's a good thing. They've already remitted for people that don't have capital. They want to give them capital. And how can we work on effective strategies to give, performance relationship capital to traditionally marginalized or historically marginalized folks where we're already there. So that's the way I do it. It's an element. I'm a middle school teacher. And many of these strategies that I use are just middle school classroom management. I've got to keep my students engaged. And honestly, folks, there ain't no difference a lot of time between middle school students and adults. In fact, middle school students are probably more engaged. So if you can get the middle school students to listen, I promise you can get adults to listen.
Oh, I know that's right.
Yeah. So it's discussed, and that's why, Charles, and you and I've talked about this. That's why I don't lead with advocacy. That's why I don't lead with right-wrong conversations. That's why I don't lead with judgment. I love what Dr. Brene Brown says about judgment, that judgment kills brave spaces. And let's recognize all humans operate in judgment. So the practice of recognizing our judgment and suspending it is, in fact, it's a daily practice. We will never become experts. We will always be in the process of developing those tool sets, right? And so when you understand, this is a lifelong journey. And that's the difference between recognizing DEI as an engagement strategy versus political correctness of the 90s. When I, I'm a seasoned 60-year-old, right? So I can remember when President Nixon went to the capital of China in 1972. The capital of China, the way Walter Cronkite reported it, was Peking. Y'all remember that? Then all of a sudden I woke up one day and the capital of China is Beijing. Right? So they changed the words without telling us, Here's why we're now changing the vocabulary. I remember, again, being a liberal arts major, how we used to talk about the Orient. In fact, there was, Northwest Orient, the Orient Express. Now, to say Orient is passé, even though that is Shakespearean, now we say, East or East Asia, the Pacific Rim. So this shows us, it teaches us that language changes all the time, and it's going to change again. So I'm not I'd like to say, and my team says, we are not committed to the words. We are absolutely committed to the work. Let me tell you one more thing. So in Texas and in Florida, for the folks who don't like DEI, I never say the words DEI. You know what I say?
What do you say?
I say workforce optimization. And these folks love it. And you know what? We have an entire strategy around workforce optimization. Again, I don't want you to get caught up on the words. And if you're listening to a media outlet that is talking about DEI, saying DEI means didn't earn it, then I'm going to come into a space and I'm never going to say those words. I'm just going to style flex. I'm going to meet you where you are, and I'm going to use language that continues to engage and keep you in the process of growing and evolving. That's why neuroscience, that's why cultural intelligence, that's why emotional intelligence is so important, because it teaches us as humans, we get to meet folks where they are. And we get to recognize that feelings, that emotions, they're a part of us. Again, in the 20th century, we're like, oh, well, leave that part out. You just come to work and you focus on the job. Well, that was always a mythology, because I haven't figured out a way to send myself to work and leave the human part of me at home. Everywhere we go, we take ourselves with us. So this is a recognition of the truth of who we are, and leaning into that, where our humanity gets to be a superpower to create that connection, belonging, and safety for others.
I have another question here in the chat. It says, why cushion the truth for white people when they know what they are doing?
Because mythology is a powerful thing. And there are a lot of folks who don't know that they don't know. It is amazing. And again, let's go back to Juneteenth. Now, I've been celebrating Juneteenth in some form or fashion since I was a little boy growing up in Lumberton, North Carolina. How many white people have we encountered who had no clue? Because the American educational system created no space for us. Most white people in the 70s and 60s, when I was going to school, knew about Martin Luther King, knew about Frederick Douglass, and Harriet Tubman,
and Malcolm
X, and that was it. So, and when the mythology of America did not create space for us. Black history started with slavery rather than starting with the ancient empires of Mali, of Egypt, of Timbuktu. Europeans and other folks around the world certainly knew African history, because African history is world history. That's not taught in the American educational system. When you look at the standards, even for California, you would say, oh, progressive California. No, they're not there. And I'm from a long line of educators. My mom is an educator. Both of my grandmothers, distinguished educators in the New York City public school systems and the North Carolina public school systems. And they had to bring their own curriculum to teach their students about Black history. I knew about Benjamin Banneker. I knew about, L'Enfant, who designed Washington, D.C. I knew that because I learned it at home. I remember when Shirley Chisholm ran for president in 1972 or 74.
74.
Shirley Chisholm was a soror of my grandmother's, and they were really good friends. And I remember going to school with a Shirley Chisholm for president button. I got detention for being a communist. because it was Sister Mary Joachim at that time. I went to St. Francis de Sales. I'm going to shout them out because the school is closed now, so I could tell all the laundry, right? But my teacher said, a woman will never be president, especially a colored woman. So you must be a communist.
So,
And this is my lived experience. I'm not making this up. And I'm sure you have similar stories. I'm sure lots of your participants have similar stories about what our lived experience is as people of African descent growing up on the American continent. There's just this constant flow, and the mythology is so powerful that the mythology doesn't even create space for an alternative viewpoint. Again, we all learned in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, the Nina Pinta and Santa Maria, but we never learned 200 years earlier, the Emperor of Mali, which was the most powerful empire in the world, sailed with thousands of ships to the West Indies. They never told you that the way Christopher Columbus got to America is with African navigators. They never told you that when Christopher Columbus arrived in Santo Domingo, Dominica, that the indigenous folks that greeted him there had spears with gold that was created, the gold tip spears, in West Africa. They left out that part. They left out a lot. So if you go in and say, oh, they don't know. White people didn't know about Black Wall Street. White people did not know about all of anytime there was a racial riot, it was whites violently responding to Black wealth, to Black advances. And the trauma that many of us carry in our bodies is that fear, that apprehension that whatever we have amassed can be taken away whenever the dominant culture wants to take it away. Democracy is qualified democracy. The history of the United States is not democracy for all, it's democracy for some. Conversely, or I should say in the same token, that's also the same conversation about democracy in Australia, democracy in South Africa, and candidly, democracy in Israel. It's not for everybody. The headlines is that, equal under the law, that we're all equal, but the lived experience is something completely different. So we get to what cultural intelligence and emotional intelligence does. It doesn't make assumptions. So I'm going to presume, unless I've taught you, that you don't know what you don't know. And so that's the most effective strategy. So again, that middle school classroom strategy. Let me teach you line upon line, precept upon precept. Let you get the concept. Let me give you the tools, and then let me release you so that you can continue in your own journey of discovery and learning. That's what I found has always been the most effective strategy, as opposed to coming in, you know what you did, you're wrong, you got to do the right thing. That just creates, and it's not effective today because it's not working. That's why I don't use it, because it's not effective.
Let's go back to the words, to the word nerd gang.
Okay.
So tell us, could you explain the difference between diversity, equity, and inclusion, and why each is essential in the workplace?
Absolutely. Diversity purely and simply is who we are. It is the sum total of all humanity. Diversity is a strength. When you look at the planet Earth, 90% of the world is of color. It is important because it is a recognition that we live in a global village and that each of us has something powerfully contribute to humanity. Equity, different from equality. Equity is about the removal of barriers to create maximum outcomes for all individuals. It is important because no two individuals are the same. And if I'm looking to create engagement, then I get to meet people where they are so that they can thrive, so that they can grow, so that they can maximize their full potential. And an organization full of humans reaching their full potential is a very high performing organization. That organization can do anything. Where there is that alignment, there is that maximum power and effectiveness. Inclusion is a recognition that I see you, that I hear you, that I feel you, that I celebrate you, that I acknowledge you. It is a recognition that you are not an afterthought, that you are a vital contributing human, and that this organization requires the unique and individual effort of all of the humans within that organization. And if we were to add belonging, belonging is that sense that, just like some of your spiritual practices may be Christianity, and the Christ said, "Come as you are." And so it is a recognition that each of us, regardless of gender, regardless of orientation, regardless of age, regardless of generation, regardless of our various abilities, has something very, very powerful to offer. And that term accessibility, the A, and you may see this in some jurisdictions, that I was doing a lot of work with the city of Aspen, Colorado, and their initiative was a DEI.
Mhm.
And so accessibility, recognition that no two humans have the same level of ability. It's interesting, Charles. We have legal definitions of disability, right, with the Americans with Disabilities Act, and in many jurisdictions like California, like Maryland, like Illinois, and New York, there is a state equivalent. But there is no scientific definition of disability, because disability, like race and gender, are constructs. Construct is a fancy academic word saying humans just made it up. People think that conversations about gender expression, gender identity, people think that those are new conversations. But the reality is that Homo sapiens, being the dominant species on the planet, that is a 70,000 to 100,000 year arc. Many humans think that, civilization is what, 5,000 years?
Mhm.
Civilization as Homo sapiens is actually 100,000 years, right?
Mhm.
And so we focus on the last chapters and think we read the whole book. Nah, bro, you got to read the whole book. So when you read the whole book, you found out that humans throughout that 70,000 to 100,000 year history have all had different types of gender expressions and identities, and lots of things that we believe are etched in stone have really only been etched in stone in the last 500 years or so. And so it's through studying humankind, we recognize that these are occurrences that it's not politically correct, it's not woke. These are things that have always been going on. And we get to be that lifelong student and get to educate ourselves that this is not a reaction, or this is not, and full disclosure, I'm a proud member of the LGBTQ community. You mentioned in the bio that I was a former board member of the Sacramento Gay and Lesbian Center. I was actually the board president. And I was actually served in Equality California, which is the largest LGBTQ civil rights organization in California. Served on that as well. So we all get to show up with our identities, plural, because we're more than just one thing. And that's the importance of having conversations that are engagement, having conversations that are meeting people where they are, versus having pure advocacy conversations. Now, again, there are times for advocacy conversations. I think they are more effective after we've had engagement conversations, after we've developed that psychological safety and connection, that now we can go into the deeper conversation. Just like in math, once I get you comfortable, once you understand the concept of linear equations, now we can talk about exponents, now we can talk about different things, because we have that resiliency that intellectual resiliency that we can handle the truth.
Ooh, now this one right here, now this is going to be pretty deep. And I know that this is pretty much some of the things that you've spoken on, but can you tell us how can organizations effectively measure the success of their DEI initiatives?
Oh, great question. And I do this all the time. So yeah, I have lots of conversations, especially in the local government space, about benchmarks. Like, can you give us rubrics? Can you give us benchmarks? I absolutely can. And there's that saying, it was attributed to Ben Franklin. I don't know who actually said it. One of your participants may, and they can put that in the chat. You've heard that saying, comparison is the thief of joy. So when I'm working with Aspen, Colorado, I tell them, you don't want to be like Denver. You want to be the best version of Aspen. When I'm working in Tampa, Florida, you don't want to be like Miami. You want to be the best version of Tampa, Florida. So local government or public education entity or university, what are your goals? I think that the goals and the benchmarks get to be customized. So what works, I've done work in LA County. LA County is the largest county government in the United States. There are 115,000 employees. LA County has more people than, some countries have employees, right? You know what I'm saying? So, what's important to you? And these are conversations that I have with leadership about identify for me how you want to measure your success. It looks different for different people. Is there a way to measure it? Absolutely. But I think that I don't want to be judgmental and say it's lazy when you say, well, yeah, we want to use the same measurements of XYZ city and we're ABC city. No, we get to develop those together. We get to align around them because what does your staff, what do the people that work here feel is an important measurement for are we making success? It can be, for example, the number of grievances or complaints, number of discrimination lawsuits, the amount of workers' comp leaves or stress leaves. Because if an organization is toxic, folks are going to be trying to leave that organization. So you're going to look at recidivism. You're going to look at, quiet quitting. You're going to look at how many people choose to stay in the organization. What is the average tenure within the organization, right? So those are some benchmarks you can look at. You can look at recruitment strategies. How many people who actually apply for a job for us actually stick around through the entire interview process? Or they say, oh, nope, I heard about y'all. I put my application there, but I ain't going to go work there. I'm going to go work for another organization. So that there is an infinity number of benchmarks. And I share that when I'm working with an organization. And it's important for the organization to do the work. So I partner with the organization. So we'll come up with the benchmarks that are important to you, but it's not effective to say, oh, well, we want what the city down the street has or what the organization next door has. We get to, through our own strategic planning process, through our own self-evaluation process, figure out what's working best for us. And what do we want to elevate and highlight as a hallmark for working in our organization that we can, through our, whether it's a continuous quality improvement process, we can review, we can assess, we can evaluate.
So, what are some common challenges organizations face when trying to implement comprehensive DEI programs?
Great question. First one, common challenge is fear. Before fear, failure to define what the initiative is. And Charles, I know we had this conversation and we may touch upon it, but when we're looking at what's going on in the landscape now, let's go back to 2020. 2020, you had the murder of George Floyd, you had the global pandemic, you had this universal outcry that something must change. The status quo is not effective. And essentially, you had two groups of organizations. You had one group of organization that's reactive. Ooh, we got to do something. We got to do something. Let's hire a chief diversity officer. Let's make a statement about how DEI is important for us. Let's do all of these things. They're the reactive. Then you had many of my clients who were in the responsive. We know we need to do something. We want to be wise. We want to be thoughtful. We want to be prudent. We want to be judicious. We don't just want to rush out and do something for window dressing. We really want to make a concerted effort to do something meaningful. So the reactive group, the first group I was talking about, when I'm reactive, that is not sustainable. So in the reactive space, 2020, I hired a chief diversity officer. We did some training on implicit bias. We marched in the Juneteenth parade. We gave everybody Martin Luther King Day off for the first day, for the first time ever. But now by 2022, you're like, okay, we did this for 2 years, so now we done yet? Are we done? We're done, yeah. Okay, we made our statement. Now let's go back to the way. And so what you saw in the media was like, I believe 68% of the chief diversity officers in the United States, almost 70% of them were hired in 2020. And probably an equal number were laid off by the end of 2022. Because it's reactionary. That's not sustainable. The other column that you don't hear about are the folks who are thoughtful, who are consistent, who are really looking at this from a change management, through a change management lens, through an organizational transformational lens, who understands this is long-term. It's all about sustainability. It's all about making sure I have the resources and the organizational resiliency to make it through the bumps and the bruises and the changes and all the things. Those are the folks that I have predominantly been working with. So when you're hearing this stuff in the news about, oh, this particular organization and that organization in this state is getting rid of DEI, yes, that's going on, but that's going on by many of the organizations who were reactive. Now, there is a political element as well, and that political element has been alive and well in the United States, excuse me, since the inception of the United States. And so the same folks who are against the rights of gendered females, who are against trans rights, who are against reproductive freedoms, who are against the rights of immigrants, are also the same folks who are against the current DEI initiatives, because it is perceived, it's just looking at it as anti-Black. That's always been around, and those folks haven't gone anywhere, and that's old news. So when the media is packaging is like this a separate entity from what's going on with, for example, women's reproductive rights, I look at it differently. I look at it that's part of the same. That's part of the same counter movement, which is just, if you will, a doubling down of white supremacy, from my perspective.
Mm. There's one of the other questions here that was just in the chat. They want to know, do you have a political party affiliation?
Yes, I do. I have participated in all of the political parties, and I identify as independent. I believe in looking at the efficacy of the individual candidate. And I can tell you that there are partners that I work with who are champions of DEI from all the parties, from the Republican Party, from the Democratic Party, from the Green Party, from the Independent Party. This is not, no one party has a monopoly on this. And the other thing that it's important, DEI is not a political conversation. It does not equate to partisanship. You can be Democrat, Republican, Independent, Green, Communist, whatever the party, and still be an effective champion of DEI. And just because you're one party does not mean you have a tendency to either lean in or repel against engagement for creating connection and belonging and safety for all humans. I believe that regardless of a political party, that you can be a champion of DEI. And again, that's what folks try to package this. Oh, this is a democratic movement. This is a blue movement. No, this is a human movement. This is a human movement for human engagement to maximize and elevate the lived experience of every single human. This transcends politics.
So the follow up to that is this question is, when we talk about Black people, white people say it's a political topic. So wouldn't DEI be political?
Absolutely not. DEI is about how do we elevate the lived experience of every single human. I don't think it's a political topic. I think it's an anthropological topic. I think it is an emotional intelligence topic. I think it is a cultural humility topic. I think it is an organizational transformational topic. I think it should never be a political topic, because politics by its very nature is divisive. And this is a strategy that allows every human, everyone, every person, every individual to participate.
And how can organizations encourage open dialogue about race without causing discomfort or division among employees?
So I think that organizations should have formal learning and education opportunities and informal learning and education opportunities. I think it's important to elevate the reality of folks' lived experience. I think it's important to learn real history, not mythology. I think it's important to recognize that every single culture on the planet has value, has gifts, is something that should be leaned into. I think it's an opportunity for us to grow. I think it's important for us. I think the organizations should practice cultural resiliency. They should get folks used to that concept of getting comfortable being uncomfortable for the purpose of growth. It's like when you're learning a new sport, you're learning how to swim, you're learning a new dance, you're going to be awkward at it. It's going to be uncomfortable. You're going to judge yourself. You're going to want to quit. But creating an atmosphere where you remove judgment, where you allow folks the opportunity to practice the language, practice the ways of being. So it's more than training and development. It's also about coaching. It's also about creating these practice spaces where folks get to grow and learn individually, and they get to come together to continue to grow and learn. I think having those options is, I think that's paramount to the success of this organizational change management strategy.
From your perspective, what are the most effective ways to address implicit bias in the workplace?
Oh, wow. So I've got a whole series of trainings on that. But to answer the question succinctly, it's first of all, removing judgment from the conversation. Secondly, it's recognizing that all human beings have bias. All human beings, since humans became the dominant species on the planet as members of Homo sapiens, have bias. That bias is clearly a mindset, and that humans epigenetically developed this mindset, right? So it's leaning into, hey, we all have this. And so how do we get to be effective in recognizing our own bias? Let's create that safety, those safe spaces, so we can be truly reflective to recognize all humans have bias. And
Right.
how do we disrupt? So I think eliminating, let me be a word nerd again, Charles. So we can disrupt bias, we can recognize bias, we can neutralize bias. I don't think we can eliminate it because it's a part of who we are as humans. And so, if bias is a mindset, it's also recognizing when the mindset becomes action, the bias mindset becoming action are microaggressions or micro behaviors or subtle acts of exclusion, whichever term you'd like to use. But when we see the conduct playing out that creates harm for other humans, I think it's important to have those mechanisms in place within the organization. That includes training and development. It also includes coaching. It's using that crucial conversations framework to meet folks where they are, to get them to reflect on their words. Like, say, for example, I've got a fro now, but typically I wear my hair in cornrows. And so if a person who is not African American comes to me and is like, "Oh my God, your hair is cool. Can I touch your hair?" It's having a conversation with them about understanding the impact on those words, and the historical impact that in the Western Hemisphere, most of the humans, Africanized humans, indigenous humans, gendered female humans, did not operate with self-agency. So asking me, "Can you touch my hair?" may be traumatizing for me because in my lived experience, or within the 8 generations that my family's been in the United States, I had no choice if someone of the dominant culture wanted to, touch any part of me. And so it's a recognition of getting them to reflect on the words, to understand the history, and to give alternatives. Curiosity is natural. You can say, "Hey, your hair is cool. I like the way that it can be, a fro one day, it can be cornrows another day." I could guide you to YouTube or any number of social media outlets where you can learn about natural hair and the history of natural hair and learn about natural hairstyles. So that human curiosity is a good thing. Or to say to a Black person, "Wow, you're so articulate." Well, I'm a subject matter expert. I'm a published author. I'm a professor. Of course I'm articulate. If I were presenting as a white male, would you say the same thing? Or would you comment on the quality of what I was saying, not on the manner in which I'm delivering? You know what I'm saying? So it's recognizing that we don't get reactive, but again, using that crucial conversations framework, creating that psychological safety for both participants, and then using the crucial conversations protocols to inform, to educate, to enlighten, to create new levels of awareness for that individual.
What strategies have you seen successfully increase representation of marginalized groups in leadership positions?
Great question. Most recently, the strategy that I have seen and that my organization is elevating is simple strategies. For example, within organizations, career ladder programs, emerging leaders programs, the whole concept of building the pipeline, right? Of growing. You want to cultivate leaders? Let's develop leaders within our organization. You want to create great employees? Most people say, "Well, let's do college recruitment." The strategy I'm giving employers: start at middle school, because by 6th, by 7th, by 8th grade, students are starting to formulate, what do I want to be when I become an adult? If you can get students to recognize there are so many well-paying jobs in local government that you don't need a college degree. You need a high school diploma, and you may need a certification from a junior college or community college, or you may be able to get that certification online. But it is possible that you can graduate from high school and get a certification and make close to 6 figures a year doing really cool jobs, working in government without having to go to all of that additional cost and expense of going to a university. It's giving young people the options at an early age so that they can create goals and objectives for themselves that's going to reduce the dropout rate and recidivism between middle school and high school, keep them engaged, keep them focused on attention, attendance, keep them focused on achievement because they see what's at the end of the tunnel, as opposed to a student feeling that he, that she, that they have no options, and therefore they're going to, pursue a path that may be problematic or maybe even detrimental to their health and well-being. So I think it's those effective strategies that are really working. Yeah, you can do all the, we're going to create these, massive programs and spend lots of money, but the programs I'm talking about, Charles, are really simple and zero or no cost. It's about creating meaningful partnerships. It's about whenever you have a recruitment, now recognizing it's not just posting the job on the website or in Indeed or LinkedIn, but it's really creating partnerships with different types of organizations that can begin to feed highly qualified candidates into the pipeline so that you have highly qualified, diverse pools from which to hire staff, but more importantly, from which to cultivate your leadership. And it's a recognition that coaching and development gets to be a way of life for the organization. It's interesting whenever you go through, and my experience, especially in government and in education, when there is an economic downturn, where there are budget crises, the first thing people cut is what? Training and development. And how can you grow and how can you evolve as an organization when you're going to cut your training and development budget? So it's a recognition that education matters, not just, K-12 or college, but being lifelong learners, creating those educational, those training, those development opportunities all throughout the life cycle of one's employment. So those are strategies that I think that I'm utilizing with my partners in local government and public education and state agencies that I've seen be very, very effective.
Well, that's a great lead into this question, which is, how can organizations ensure pay equity across different demographic groups?
So it's interesting that you bring up pay equity. The first legislation on pay equity was in federal legislation in the 1930s. And almost 100 years later, Charles, we're still having those conversations. So there are some effective tools and strategies, but the core of that is, am I being intentional and mindful when I'm looking at my compensation structure, that I am removing all of the hidden barriers? For example, am I paying a man who's head of household? Well, let me ask the question conversely. Am I paying a single gendered female the same thing that I'm paying a man who's head of household? Am I paying a female head of household the same thing that I'm paying a male head of household? It's creating more transparent mechanisms for determining where am I placed on the salary schedule. And again, the government sector is very, very different than the private sector. But even in government, it's interesting to see how folks are brought in. Now, by certain collective bargaining agreements, they may require that everyone within the certain classification be brought in at the same step. But we know in the private sector, there is far more latitude. And typically that latitude has benefited gendered males, has benefited those who are, well, let me say it this way, has not always benefited those individuals who are non-white. And so it's having the organizational fortitude to really explore and be honest about what you're seeing, and then making those necessary adjustments, and recognizing that the pay equity issue America's been dealing with for 100 years. And so, legislation in and of itself ain't gonna make it go away, because if that were the case, we would have ended it in the 1930s. And yet we're still, having those conversations. There's still the pay gap between men and women. There's still the pay gap between white and non-white. There's still the pay gap, candidly, between heterosexual and members of the LGBT community. There are lots of different pay gaps, and so having that organizational resiliency and courage to really look at the data, to share the data with with the organization, because trust me, people talk. People within the organization know how much everybody's making, even though, like in the government sector, it's public record. In the private sector, it's supposed to be private, but everybody knows. And so let's approach it as if everyone knows, and let's have an open book discussion about where folks are, and really work earnestly to address and resolve those issues. But it's not going to be resolved just through one classification and compensation study. It's not. That can help, but a lot of these issues are structural and systemic. Again, they've been going on for a long time. And so, I don't expect that to end anytime soon. But we can still make some meaningful advances.
So in the overall perspective of what we have just covered and what you have just gave us this wonderful lecture on, because it was really eloquent, and I love all the things that we've just discussed. How do we solve the DEI issue?
So the DEI issue isn't an issue to solve. It is a strategy that can help lift us or guide us to our next level of elevation. I think we're at a very important crossroads in the United States, in the world. And so I see opportunity. This is the first time, never before in the history of the world has humanity been connected by the speed of light through these amazing technological devices, where we couldn't have had this type of conversation 20 years ago. We couldn't have, think about, all the technology that developed just since 2008. Think about all the new technology that just develops in 2020, right? Never before have so many people on the planet been focused on justice and empowerment and a true emancipation philosophy for all peoples. So that's a good thing. Yeah, the status quo folks want to keep things the way they are because they have a vested interest. But I believe that where things have the potential to go benefit those of us who support the upliftment and empowerment of all people. I think we need to be vigilant. I think we need to recognize that, just like democracy is not just automatic and it just happens and pops out of a box. I think equity, inclusion, belonging, accessibility, I think those are core values that we must be, voraciously focused on. I think that needs to be a part of our DNA. And we have the saying, we want to make DEI a part of your organizational DNA. Well, that comes with intention. That's to recognize where we are, recognize what the American ideal, and recognize where the American reality is, and recognize what does it take to close the gap. Let's recognize that there are no two humans that think the same way. So let's not dehumanize and vilify another human simply because they think differently than us. They may be of a different political party. They may see the world differently, but that doesn't mean we marginalize them or we dehumanize them. Let's recognize that growth requires intestinal fortitude. Another way of saying that is guts, courage. We need to be comfortable being uncomfortable for our growth. We need to recognize that, yes, we can get there, but it's going to take the efforts of everyone. And let's really uplift developing that emotional intelligence, that cultural intelligence. Let's uplift neuroscience. Let's uplift truth and learning the real truth of our history. Let's abandon that mythology. Let's recognize that, let's recognize the impact of white body supremacy on all of our lives. I like this saying where someone says, white supremacy isn't the shark in the water. White supremacy is the water. It is in the air we breathe. That's in as in everything that we consume. And let's be aware of that. And let's lift truth high. Let's still engage with our folks, our colleagues, our friends, our fellow citizens who may think differently. And the solution isn't eliminating them. The solution is we all get to grow together because we need each other. We absolutely need each other, and it's a recognition that we really ground ourselves further in our humanity, so that we can lift each other up in the essence of our aspirational humanity.
Well, I tell you, Jacques, this has been totally, totally wonderful. And I am so glad that you blessed us with your presence. We weren't able to get through the whole entire questioning, but I definitely hope that you would bless us with a second appearance on the show at any time, because this was really fruitful thought. And
Well, I was going to say thank you so much, Charles. I had a fabulous time. And of course, I'd love to come. Anything for you. I will always come back for Charles. And thank you to the participants. For those of you could have done anything on this holiday. I'm so honored and so humbled that you took your time to be here with us today. Thank you so much for your questions. They were awesome. Again, I'm on LinkedIn, Jacques Whitfield. And so if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I would love, and you could reach Charles as well on LinkedIn. And I would welcome the opportunity to come back at any time. And like you said, we're only scratched the surface, and definitely looking forward to more. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you again. And for those that are watching, especially those that are watching on the YouTube channel, please hit the subscribe and notifications button. So anytime we do a show, you'll be able to catch the show. This was a very special and great Juneteenth special that I was definitely looking forward to. And it definitely made me proud and happy to have this show tonight. So I thank you all. You all have a great evening. And I will see you all tomorrow evening. Have a wonderful night. Thank you again, Jacques. We definitely love you, and I definitely need to have you back.
I look forward to it, and thank you so much.